I was sitting on my porch, watching the sunset over the Colorado plains, when 3 white SUVs came barreling down my dirt road, kicking up dust like a cavalry charge. That should have been my first warning that everything was about to go sideways. My name is Patrick Jensen, and I own a 100-acre ranch about 15 miles outside of Boulder. I bought this property back in 2019, a beautiful piece of land with rolling hills, a creek running through the western edge, and enough space to raise horses and cattle without anyone breathing down my neck. The previous owner had been a crusty old rancher named Bill Morrison, who'd owned it since the 70s. When I bought it, the property was technically outside city limits and definitely not part of any HOA. That was one of the main selling points. I'd spent 10 years living in a cookie-cutter subdivision in Denver where the HOA measured your grass height and fined you if your mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Never again, I'd promised myself. The SUVs screeched to a halt in front of my house, and out stepped a woman in her mid-40s wearing an immaculate white pantsuit that was completely inappropriate for a ranch visit. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight, I wondered if it gave her migraines, and she carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my truck. "Mr. Jensen?" she called out, her heels already caked in dust. I set down my beer and stood up, walking to the edge of the porch. "That's me. Can I help you?" "My name is Brenda Sullivan, president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. We have an emergency situation that requires immediate access to your property." I felt my jaw tighten. "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not part of any HOA." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, Mr. Jensen, that's where you're mistaken. When Boulder County rezoned this area in 2022, your property was incorporated into our jurisdiction. You should have received notification." "I received nothing," I said flatly. Brenda opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Nevertheless, the legal reality stands. And right now, we have a sewage emergency. The main line for our entire development runs beneath your property, and it's catastrophically failing. We need to excavate immediately." I descended the porch steps slowly, my boots thudding on the wood. "Hold on, you're telling me there's a sewer line under my ranch? That's impossible. This land's been agricultural for 50 years. The easement was established in 1987, Brenda said, flipping through her papers. When the county approved the Meadowbrook Heights development, they granted us an easement across what was then Mr. Morrison's property. The sewer main runs approximately 400 yards beneath your northern pasture." My mind was racing. Bill never mentioned anything like that. Perhaps he wasn't aware of its exact location. The line runs quite deep, and it's never required maintenance until now. She glanced at her watch. "Mr. Jensen, we don't have time for a lengthy discussion. We have sewage backing up into 47 homes. We need to bring in excavators tonight." "Tonight?" I almost laughed. "You're out of your mind. I've got cattle in that pasture, irrigation lines, fencing. You can't just tear it up." Brenda's expression hardened. "We have every legal right under the easement. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll obtain a court order, and you'll be liable for any damages caused by the delay." Behind her, 2 men in business casual were unloading surveying equipment from one of the SUVs. This wasn't a request. They were preparing to move forward with or without my permission. "I want to see this easement document," I said, "and I want my lawyer to review it before you touch anything." Brenda handed me a set of papers. "Of course. But our contractors will be here at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning regardless. I suggest you move your livestock." She turned on her heel and walked back to her SUV, the 2 men following. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust with a stack of legal documents I couldn't make sense of. I spent that entire evening on the phone. First with my lawyer, Tom Chen, who sounded skeptical but promised to review the easement first thing in the morning. Then with my neighbor, Marcus, who'd lived in the area his whole life. "Yeah, I remember when they built Meadowbrook," Marcus said. "Rich folk from Denver wanting mountain views without actually living in the mountains. They had to run utilities out pretty far. I always wondered where their sewer went." "Apparently under my land," I muttered. "That's rough, buddy. Those HOA people are vultures. They sued the Hendersons 3 years ago over a property line dispute. Bankrupted them." That was exactly what I needed to hear. I hung up and poured myself a whiskey, looking out at my northern pasture. In the fading light, I could just make out my Herefords grazing peacefully. Tomorrow, apparently, that peace was going to be shattered. I barely slept. At 5:30 a.m., I was already out in the pasture with my ranch hand, Diego, moving the cattle to the southern grazing area. The Herefords weren't happy about the early relocation, but we got them settled by the time the first contractor trucks appeared on the horizon. Tom called at 6:15. "Patrick, I've reviewed the documents. The easement is legitimate. It was filed with the county in 1987, and it gives the HOA the right to access and maintain the sewer infrastructure. How did I not know about this when I bought the place? It should have shown up in the title search, but these old easements sometimes slip through, especially if they've never been exercised. The good news is they're required to restore your property to its original condition and compensate you for any damages." "Define damages," I said, watching a massive excavator being unloaded from a flatbed. "Crop loss, fence repair, soil remediation. You should document everything. Take photos, videos, keep detailed records." By 7 a.m., my peaceful ranch looked like a construction zone. There were 4 excavators, 2 dump trucks, a crane, and about 20 workers in hard hats. A man who introduced himself as Gary, the project supervisor, showed me a survey map with a red line drawn across my pasture. "The main line runs here," he said, tracing the line with his finger. "We'll need to dig a trench about 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide. It's going to be roughly 400 yards long." I stared at the map. That trench would cut right through my irrigation system, destroy probably 2 acres of pasture, and come within 50 feet of my equipment barn. "How long is this going to take?" Gary shrugged. "Depends on what we find. If it's just a collapsed section, maybe a week. If the whole line needs replacing, could be a month." "A month?" "Look, I'm just the contractor. You'll need to talk to the HOA about timeline." I pulled out my phone and called the number on Brenda's business card. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Jensen, I trust the work is progressing smoothly." "Smoothly? You're tearing up my property. I need answers. How long is this going to take, and what exactly am I being compensated for?" "The HOA will cover all reasonable expenses related to the repair. As for timeline, we're working as quickly as possible. I'm sure you understand we have 47 families without functioning plumbing. What I understand is that I'm bearing the burden of your infrastructure failure. This is your sewer line, your problem, and it's destroying my land. It's actually everyone's problem, Mr. Jensen, including yours, since you're technically part of our community now. I never agreed to be part of your community." There was a pause. "The rezoning wasn't optional, but let's not be adversarial. I'll have our attorney prepare a compensation proposal. In the meantime, please allow the workers to do their job." She hung up before I could respond. I watched the excavators tear into my pasture, their diesel engines roaring, massive buckets ripping up earth and grass that had taken years to establish. Diego stood beside me, shaking his head. "This is bad, boss," he said quietly. He had no idea how bad it was about to get. By that afternoon, the workers had exposed the sewer line. I wandered over during their lunch break to get a look. The pipe was massive, at least 3 feet in diameter, made of concrete, and it was in terrible shape. Large sections had crumbled completely, and the surrounding soil was saturated with sewage. Gary was standing in the trench, his face grim. "This is worse than we thought. The whole line's compromised. We're going to need to replace at least 500 yards, maybe more." "That's more than you said this morning." "That's because this morning we didn't know the full extent of the damage. This pipe's been leaking for years, probably decades. You see this soil? It's completely contaminated." I felt my stomach drop. Contaminated? Sewage saturation. We're going to need environmental remediation. That means removing all this soil, probably down to 10 feet, and replacing it with clean fill. "How much soil are we talking about?" Gary did some quick math on his phone. "Roughly 2,000 cubic yards, maybe more." I called Tom immediately. "They're saying environmental remediation. What does that mean for me?" "It means the contamination has to be cleaned up to EPA standards. The HOA is responsible for the costs, but, Patrick, if they're saying the leak has been ongoing for years, there could be groundwater contamination. You might want to get your well tested." "My well?" "My drinking water." The water I used for everything on the ranch. Are you serious? Better safe than sorry. I'll email you a list of certified testing labs. I hung up and looked toward my house, where my well was located about 200 yards from the trench. If sewage had been leaking into the groundwater for years, there was no telling what I'd been drinking. The next morning, a water testing technician arrived and took samples from my well. The results would take 3 days. In the meantime, I bought cases of bottled water and tried not to think about how many showers I'd taken, how many meals I'd cooked, how many times I'd filled water buckets for the horses. Brenda showed up that afternoon with her attorney, a slick-looking guy named Richard Pembroke. They found me in the barn, where I was repairing a saddle and trying to stay out of the way of the construction chaos. "Mr. Jensen, we need to discuss the scope of the project," Brenda said without preamble. I set down my tools. "I'm listening." Richard pulled out yet another set of documents. "The damage to the sewer line is extensive. We're looking at a complete replacement of approximately 600 yards of pipe. The project will take 4 to 6 weeks. 6 weeks? Possibly longer, and we need to expand the easement." I felt heat rising in my chest. Expand it? That easement's already tearing up my property. "The new pipe needs to be installed with modern specifications," Richard explained. "That requires a wider trench, additional access points, and room for maintenance equipment. We're requesting an expansion of the easement from 20 feet to 40 feet. "Absolutely not." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Jensen, we can petition the county for an expanded easement if necessary. It would be much easier if you simply agreed." "Nothing about this is easy for me," I shot back. "You've invaded my property, contaminated my soil, possibly poisoned my water, and now you want to take more land?" "We're not taking anything," Richard said smoothly. "The easement is a right of access, not ownership. You retain ownership of the land. Ownership of poisoned land I can't use. Which is why we're preparing a compensation package." Richard handed me another document. "We're offering $25,000 for your cooperation and any inconvenience caused." I looked at the paper. $25,000 wouldn't begin to cover the damage to my pasture, the lost grazing time, the stress to my animals, the potential well contamination, or the weeks of chaos. Not to mention the long-term impact on my property value. "This is insulting," I said, handing it back. Brenda's pleasant mask slipped a bit. "Mr. Jensen, you need to be reasonable. We have a community emergency. People can't live in their homes without functioning sewage. And I can't run my ranch with a construction site in the middle of it. Why is your emergency my responsibility?" "Because the easement makes it your responsibility," Richard said. "Legally, you're required to allow access. The compensation is a courtesy." I looked between them. "Get off my property. If you want to expand the easement, petition the county. Until then, you work within the original 20-foot width, and I want a real assessment of damages from an independent appraiser." Brenda's face flushed red. "You're making a serious mistake." "That's my prerogative." They left, but I knew it wasn't over. That evening, I received an email from Richard Pembroke with a notice that the HOA would be filing an emergency petition with Boulder County for easement expansion. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. The water test results came back 2 days later. My well water showed elevated levels of coliform bacteria and nitrates, both indicators of sewage contamination. The lab recommended I stop using the well immediately and consider drilling a new one. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the report. A new well would cost at least $15,000, possibly more, and there was no guarantee the new well wouldn't be contaminated too if the sewage leak had spread through the groundwater. Tom reviewed the water test results and his voice was serious. "Patrick, this is significant. The contamination proves the HOA's infrastructure has been damaging your property for an extended period. We can sue for the cost of a new well, property damage, and potentially punitive damages for negligence." "How long will that take?" "Civil litigation? Could be a year, maybe 2. I didn't have a year. I had cattle that needed water, crops that needed irrigation, and a life that was currently being torn apart. The county hearing was held in a stuffy conference room in Boulder. I sat on one side with Tom, while Brenda, Richard, and 2 other HOA board members sat on the other. A county commissioner named Janet Porter presided. Richard presented the HOA's case first, arguing that the expanded easement was necessary for modern infrastructure standards and public health. He made it sound like I was being unreasonable and obstructionist. Then it was Tom's turn. He presented the water contamination report, photos of the destroyed pasture, and a letter from Diego describing the stress the construction had caused the cattle. He argued that the HOA had failed to maintain their infrastructure, causing damage to my property, and now wanted to expand their rights without adequate compensation. Janet Porter listened to both sides, reviewed the documents, and finally spoke. Mr. Pembroke, can you explain why the HOA failed to inspect and maintain this sewer line before it reached catastrophic failure? Richard looked uncomfortable. The line was installed in 1987, Commissioner. At that time, inspection standards were different. But the HOA has owned and operated this line for nearly 40 years. What maintenance records can you provide? We're still compiling those records. So you have no maintenance records? We're working to locate them. Janet turned to me. Mr. Jensen, what compensation are you seeking? Tom answered. Our client is requesting full compensation for property damage, including soil remediation, pasture restoration, irrigation repair, and the cost of drilling a new well. Additionally, we're requesting compensation for lost use of the property during construction and a permanent easement fee for the expanded access. What are we talking about in terms of dollars? Conservatively, $250,000. Brenda gasped. That's outrageous. Janet held up a hand. Ms. Sullivan, you'll have your turn. She looked at Richard. What is the HOA prepared to offer? As we've stated, $25,000 for temporary inconvenience. That doesn't address the well contamination or the permanent easement expansion. We dispute that the contamination is related to our sewer line. Tom immediately jumped in. Commissioner, the lab report clearly shows sewage-related contaminants. The timing correlates directly with the sewer line failure. The HOA is trying to avoid responsibility. Janet looked tired. Here's my ruling. The HOA is granted a temporary expansion of the easement to 40 feet for the duration of the repair work only. However, the HOA must pay for an independent appraisal of damages to Mr. Jensen's property, including the cost of a new well. If the appraisal supports Mr. Jensen's claims, the HOA will be required to pay full compensation. Additionally, the HOA must provide all maintenance records for this sewer line for the past 20 years within 30 days, or face potential fines for failure to maintain public infrastructure. Brenda stood up. Commissioner, our homeowners can't afford these costs. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars if we have to compensate Mr. Jensen and replace the entire line. Then perhaps the HOA should have maintained the infrastructure properly, Janet said coolly. This hearing is adjourned. As we filed out, Brenda caught up with me in the hallway. Her face was tight with anger. You're going to bankrupt 47 families over this. I'm protecting my property, I replied, something you should understand being an HOA president. This isn't over, she hissed. She was right about that. The independent appraisal took 2 weeks. During that time, the construction continued, and the trench grew longer and deeper. My northern pasture looked like a war zone. The appraiser, a professional named Sarah Mitchell, spent 3 days examining every aspect of the damage. She tested soil samples, measured the affected area, assessed the irrigation damage, and consulted with well drilling experts. Her report was devastating for the HOA. Total damages, $320,000. That included $80,000 for a new well and water filtration system, $90,000 for soil remediation, $75,000 for pasture restoration, $40,000 for irrigation repair, and $35,000 for lost use and diminished property value. Tom sent the report to Richard Pembroke with a demand for payment within 60 days. Richard's response was immediate and hostile. The HOA rejected the appraisal as inflated and biased. They were offering $50,000 final offer. File the lawsuit, I told Tom. He nodded. I'll have it ready by end of week. But before we could file, something strange happened. Diego came running to my house early one morning out of breath. Boss, you need to see this. I followed him out to the construction site. The workers had stopped digging. They were all standing around the trench, looking down at something. Gary saw me approaching and held up a hand. Mr. Jensen, we've got a situation. You're going to want to call the authorities. I looked into the trench. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then it clicked. Buried beneath the sewer line, partially exposed by the excavation, were dozens of drums. 55-gallon drums, rusted and corroded, some of them leaking a dark, oily substance. "What the hell is that?" I asked. Gary shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not sewage. We need to stop work immediately and report this." I called the county environmental department. Within 2 hours, my ranch was swarming with officials in hazmat suits. The drums were tested. The results came back that afternoon. Industrial waste. Specifically, chemical solvents and heavy metals, including lead, mercury, and benzene. The environmental officer, a serious woman named Dr. Rebecca Hayes, explained the situation. "Mr. Jensen, you have a significant contamination issue. These drums appear to have been buried sometime in the late 70s or early 80s. They've been leaking for decades. Your soil and groundwater are heavily contaminated." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "How is this possible? This was agricultural land." "We're investigating, but right now we need to cordon off this area and begin remediation. This is an EPA Superfund level contamination." "Superfund? That's going to cost millions." "Yes. We'll be working to identify who's responsible. In the meantime, I'm afraid your ranch is going to be a hazardous waste site for the foreseeable future." The next few days were a blur. The EPA took over the investigation. The construction workers left. My entire northern pasture was surrounded by yellow tape and warning signs. I couldn't use the land. I couldn't water my animals from the well. I couldn't sell the property even if I wanted to. Tom was on the phone constantly with various agencies, trying to understand our legal position. The EPA investigation revealed that the drums had been buried before Bill Morrison owned the property. In the early 70s, the land had been owned by a manufacturing company that produced agricultural chemicals. When they went bankrupt in 1978, the property was sold at auction, and apparently nobody knew about the drums buried in the back pasture. Except maybe someone did know, because the HOA's sewer line had been routed directly over the dump site, and that seemed like too much of a coincidence. Tom dug into the history of the Meadowbrook Heights development. The developer who'd built the subdivision in the late 80s was a company called Summit Properties, owned by a man named Gerald Hutchinson. Summit Properties had also owned the chemical manufacturing company that originally buried the drums. "Patrick, I think Hutchinson knew about the contamination," Tom said. "He buried the sewer line over it, probably hoping it would never be discovered. If the pipe never failed, nobody would ever dig there." But it did fail. 37 years later, yes, and now it's exposed. Can we prove he knew? That's going to be difficult. Hutchinson died in 2015. His company was dissolved. But if we can find documentation, some kind of paper trail, we might be able to hold his estate responsible. The EPA investigation expanded. They brought in forensic environmental specialists, reviewed old county records, and interviewed anyone who'd worked for Summit Properties. And they found something. Dr. Hayes called me with the news. "Mr. Jensen, we've located internal memos from Summit Properties dated 1985. They conducted soil testing on your property before purchasing it and found evidence of contamination. Instead of reporting it and dealing with cleanup, they buried a sewer line over it and sold off the surrounding parcels for residential development." "That's criminal," I said. "Yes, it is. We're referring this to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential prosecution. But since Hutchinson is deceased, they may pursue charges against surviving executives who were involved." "What about my property?" "The EPA will handle remediation. It'll be funded through the Superfund program since the responsible party is essentially defunct. But I'll be honest with you, this is a multi-year project. We're talking about removing thousands of tons of contaminated soil, treating the groundwater, monitoring for decades." I sat down heavily. "So my ranch is basically worthless." "For now, yes. I'm sorry." That evening, I sat on my porch with a whiskey, watching the sunset again. Except now, instead of seeing my peaceful pasture, I saw hazmat tents, testing equipment, and warning signs. Everything I'd worked for, destroyed by decisions made before I was even born. My phone rang. It was Brenda Sullivan. "Mr. Jensen, I've been informed about the contamination discovery." Yeah, it's quite a situation. I want you to know the HOA had no knowledge of any buried waste. This is as much a shock to us as it is to you." I laughed bitterly. "Your sewer line runs right over the dump site, Brenda. You really expect me to believe that's a coincidence?" "Our HOA was established in 1992, 5 years after the development was built. We had nothing to do with the original construction." "But Summit Properties built your development, the same company that buried the waste." There was a pause. "I'm aware of the connection. Our attorney is reviewing our potential liability." "Good for you. My attorney is too. Mr. Jensen, despite our differences, we're both victims here. Perhaps we should work together rather than against each other." "Work together how?" "The HOA is considering a lawsuit against Summit Properties estate and any surviving executives. We've been damaged by this too. Our sewer line is unusable. Our property values are going to plummet when this becomes public, and we're facing potential liability for not discovering the contamination sooner." "You didn't discover it because you never maintained your infrastructure," I pointed out. "That's debatable. But regardless, we have a common enemy. We should coordinate our legal strategies." I thought about it. As much as I disliked Brenda and the HOA, she had a point. "I'll talk to my attorney." "Thank you. And Mr. Jensen, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am genuinely sorry for what's happened to your property." After she hung up, I wasn't sure if I believed her sincerity, but I also knew I needed every advantage I could get. Tom and Richard Pembroke coordinated over the next few weeks. The EPA investigation had identified 3 surviving executives from Summit Properties who'd been involved in the 1987 development. All 3 had signed off on the soil testing reports that showed contamination. All 3 had proceeded with the development anyway. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed criminal charges in early fall: conspiracy to violate environmental laws, fraud, and endangerment. The civil lawsuits followed. I filed first, seeking compensation for the destruction of my property and punitive damages for the knowing contamination. The HOA filed second, seeking damages for infrastructure failure and diminished property values. The case attracted media attention. Local news crews camped out at the edge of my property, filming the hazmat crews and interviewing environmental experts. The story went regional, then national. Suburban development built on toxic waste. Homeowners unknowingly living near contaminated site. Rancher's life destroyed by corporate greed. I gave one interview to a reporter from the Denver Post named Amanda. She was thorough and fair, and her article captured the full scope of the disaster. Within days of publication, I started receiving calls from other property owners in the area, people who'd noticed strange health issues, mysterious well contamination, unexplained dead zones in their pastures. The EPA expanded its investigation to include properties within a 2-mile radius of the dump site. They found contamination in 3 other wells and evidence that the groundwater plume extended far beyond my ranch. By winter, the case had grown into one of the largest environmental lawsuits in Colorado history. The surviving Summit Properties executives tried to claim they'd been following orders from Hutchinson and didn't know the full extent of the contamination. Their lawyers argued the statute of limitations had expired. The judge disagreed. The evidence was clear they'd knowingly concealed a toxic waste site and built homes around it. The trial began in January of the following year. I testified about discovering the contamination, about my ruined well, about watching my property being turned into a Superfund site. Other homeowners testified about health problems, sick children, pets that had died mysteriously. Environmental experts testified about the dangers of long-term exposure to the chemicals that had been leaking into the groundwater for 40 years. The defendants' attorneys tried to argue that modern EPA standards couldn't be applied retroactively to decisions made in the 80s. They tried to claim the contamination wasn't as severe as claimed. They tried to shift blame to Bill Morrison, to the original chemical company, to anyone but their clients. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found all 3 defendants guilty on all counts. The criminal sentences were significant. Each defendant received 5 years in federal prison, substantial fines, and restitution orders. But the real impact came in the civil trials. My case settled first. The defendants' insurance carriers, desperate to avoid a jury verdict, offered $2.3 million. Tom advised me to take it. The money wouldn't restore my ranch, but it would allow me to buy new property, start over somewhere clean. I accepted. The HOA's case was more complicated. They were seeking damages not just for infrastructure, but for every homeowner in the development whose property value had been affected. The total claim was over $50 million. That case went to trial, and the jury awarded $38 million. By the time all the settlements were finalized and the EPA remediation was underway, it was late spring. I'd purchased a new ranch in Montana, a beautiful piece of land near Bozeman with clean water, no easements, and definitely no HOA. Diego came with me, and we moved the cattle north. Before I left Colorado, I drove out to my old ranch one last time. The EPA had erected a fence around the entire contaminated area. Signs warned of hazardous materials. In the distance, I could see the massive excavation where they were removing poisoned soil. It would take years, maybe decades, before this land was safe again. Brenda Sullivan called me a few days after I'd moved to Montana. "Mr. Jensen, I wanted to let you know the HOA is disbanding." "What?" "The settlement money is going to the homeowners as compensation for property value loss. Most of them are selling and moving away. The development is being demolished. The county has declared the entire area unsuitable for residential use." "What about you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm moving to Arizona. My husband got a job there. We're starting over." "Good luck," I said, and I meant it. "You too, Mr. Jensen. And again, I'm sorry for how all of this began. I was just trying to fix a sewer problem." "I know." After we hung up, I walked out onto my new porch and looked at the Montana mountains. The air was clean, the water was pure, and there wasn't a sewer line or HOA for miles. I'd lost my Colorado ranch, but I'd survived. And I'd made sure the people responsible were held accountable. My neighbor in Montana, a rancher named Bill, stopped by that evening with a six-pack of beer to welcome me to the area. "Heard you had some trouble down in Colorado," he said, handing me a bottle. "You could say that." "Well, you're in good country now. No HOAs, no subdivisions, just ranchers and wide open space." We sat on the porch as the sun set over the mountains, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The EPA remediation of my old property continued for the next 3 years. The contaminated soil was excavated and transported to a proper hazardous waste facility. The groundwater was treated using a pump and treat system that would run for decades. Monitoring wells were installed throughout the area to track the contamination plume. In 2029, Dr. Hayes sent me a final report. The acute contamination had been addressed, but the property would require ongoing monitoring for at least 30 years. The state of Colorado had purchased the land and designated it as a conservation area, ensuring it would never be developed again. The 3 Summit Properties executives served their prison sentences. Upon release, they were required to pay ongoing restitution to affected property owners and contribute to the EPA's long-term monitoring costs. As for me, life in Montana was good. I'd rebuilt my herd, expanded my operation, and even got involved in local politics to ensure strong environmental protections for agricultural land. Diego had become my ranch manager, and we'd hired 2 more hands to help with the growing operation. I never joined another HOA, and I made damn sure I understood every easement, right-of-way, and restriction before I bought property. The experience in Colorado had taught me that what you don't know can destroy you, and that sometimes the biggest threats to your property aren't natural disasters or market crashes, but legal agreements made decades before you arrived. One evening, about 4 years after I'd left Colorado, I received an email from Amanda, the Denver Post reporter who'd covered my story. She was working on a follow-up piece about environmental justice and long-term impacts of corporate contamination. She wanted to know how I was doing. I wrote back, telling her about the new ranch, the clean water, the successful cattle operation. I told her I'd recovered financially, but that some scars don't heal. I still had nightmares about opening my well test results and seeing those contamination levels. I still felt a surge of anxiety whenever I saw official-looking vehicles coming down my road. But I also told her I was grateful the contamination had been discovered before it hurt more people. Grateful for the legal system that held the guilty accountable. grateful for a second chance to build something good. Her article ran a few weeks later, a thoughtful piece about resilience and accountability. She'd tracked down several other former Meadowbrook Heights residents and told their stories too. Most had moved away and were rebuilding their lives. A few had health issues they attributed to the contamination and were involved in ongoing medical monitoring. The article ended with a quote from me that I'd almost forgotten. I'd said, "The American dream includes property ownership, but that dream requires truth. When people bury toxic secrets beneath your land, they're not just poisoning the soil, they're poisoning the trust that makes communities possible." Amanda had asked if I'd ever consider moving back to Colorado. I'd told her no. Too many memories, too much pain. Montana was home now, but there was one piece of unfinished business. The original chemical company that had buried the drums, Frontier Agricultural Solutions, had dissolved in 1978. But I'd always wondered what had happened to the executives who'd made that decision, who'd chosen to bury toxic waste rather than dispose of it properly. Tom had done some digging over the years, more out of curiosity than any legal necessity. He'd found that the company's president, a man named Donald Crane, had died in 1995. But the vice president of operations, the man who would have directly overseen the waste disposal, was still alive. His name was Robert Thatcher, and he was living in a retirement community in Florida. I didn't plan to contact him. What would be the point? He was in his 80s. Whatever punishment he deserved would never come. But then Tom called with interesting news. "Patrick, you're not going to believe this. Robert Thatcher has written a memoir." "What?" "Yeah, it's self-published, probably sold all of 12 copies. But there's a chapter about his time at Frontier Agricultural. He admits to the illegal dumping." "He admits it? In writing?" "Clear as day. Says it was common practice in the 70s, that everyone did it, that they didn't understand the environmental impacts back then." "That's not an excuse." "No, it's not. And the EPA is very interested in this memoir. The statute of limitations may have expired on most charges, but there are certain environmental crimes that don't have a limitation period." The EPA and the U.S. Attorney's Office reviewed Thatcher's memoir. In it, he described not just the dumping at my former property, but at multiple sites across Colorado and Wyoming. He'd apparently written it as a way to unburden his conscience in his final years, never expecting anyone to actually read it or take action. Federal investigators began excavating the sites he'd mentioned. They found contamination at 4 additional locations. 2 were in remote areas where the environmental impact was minimal, but 2 were near residential areas, including one close to an elementary school. The U.S. attorney filed new charges. At 84 years old, Robert Thatcher was indicted on multiple counts of environmental crimes. His attorneys argued he was too old and frail for prosecution, that he'd made the admissions in good faith, that charging him now was vindictive. The judge disagreed. The severity of the crimes, the number of people affected, and the ongoing environmental damage outweighed considerations of age. The trial was scheduled for fall 2030. I didn't attend. I'd moved on with my life, and watching an elderly man face justice for decisions made 50 years ago felt less like closure and more like tragedy. But I followed the news coverage. Thatcher was convicted on 6 counts. Given his age and health, he received 3 years of house arrest, substantial fines that would consume most of his retirement savings, and he was required to cooperate fully with EPA remediation efforts at all the sites he'd contaminated. In his sentencing statement, the judge said something that stuck with me. Environmental crimes are unique in that their victims extend across generations. The decisions you made in the 1970s are still causing harm today, and will continue causing harm for decades to come. This sentence reflects not just what you did, but the ongoing consequences of those actions. Back in Montana, life continued. I'd started dating a veterinarian named Beth Simpson, who had her own practice in Bozeman. She was smart, funny, and had no interest in ever living in a subdivision. We'd bonded over our shared love of wide-open spaces and our shared distrust of HOAs. One weekend, Beth and I were riding horses across my property when she asked, "Do you ever regret buying that ranch in Colorado?" I thought about it. I regret what happened, but I don't regret the decision. I loved that land. I built something good there. The fact that it was destroyed by someone else's crimes doesn't diminish what it meant to me. That's a healthy perspective. It took a while to get there. For a long time, I was just angry. At the HOA, at Brenda, at the executives who buried the waste, at Bill Morrison for not warning me, at the title company for missing the contamination. But anger doesn't fix anything. It just eats you up. Beth nodded. So what does fix things? Accountability, justice, and moving forward. We rode in silence for a while, the Montana sky stretching endlessly above us. In the distance, I could see the mountains, snow-capped and eternal. This was good land, clean land, and I was going to take care of it the right way. That evening, I got an email from one of the former Meadowbrook Heights residents, a woman named Carol, who'd lived 3 houses down from where the sewer line had failed. She'd been part of the civil lawsuit and had received a settlement. Now she was writing to tell me she'd used some of her settlement money to start an environmental advocacy nonprofit focused on holding corporations accountable for historic contamination. Your case inspired me, she wrote. I realized we can't just accept these injustices. We have to fight for clean land, clean water, and honest dealing. Thank you for not backing down. I wrote back, encouraging her efforts and offering to contribute to her organization. If something good could come from the disaster, if my experience could help prevent similar situations for others, then maybe the whole nightmare had served a purpose. The years passed. The EPA's monitoring reports from my old property showed steady improvement in groundwater quality. The contamination plume was shrinking. In another 20 years, they estimated, the land might be safe for limited agricultural use again. It would never be suitable for residential development, but at least it wouldn't be actively poisoning the environment. The Meadowbrook Heights subdivision was completely demolished by 2031. The land was returned to open space, with warning signs explaining its history. The county used it as an example in environmental planning discussions, a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough environmental review before approving development. Brenda Sullivan sent me a Christmas card every year from Arizona. We'd developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by shared trauma. She'd gotten involved in local politics there and was advocating for stronger HOA regulations and environmental protections. I learned my lesson, she'd written in one card. HOAs should focus on genuine community needs, not petty rule enforcement, and they should never, ever be involved in major infrastructure without proper oversight. As for me, I expanded my Montana operation, brought on Diego's son as an apprentice, and married Beth in a small ceremony on the ranch in 2032. We built a life focused on sustainable ranching, environmental stewardship, and community involvement. The experience in Colorado had changed me fundamentally. I understood now that property ownership comes with responsibilities and risks that go far beyond monthly payments and property taxes. You're buying not just the land you can see, but the history buried beneath it, the legal agreements attached to it, and the long-term consequences of decisions made by people you'll never meet. I made sure every young rancher I mentored understood these lessons. I taught them to read every document, question every easement, test their water regularly, and never assume that problems buried in the past will stay buried. One of my proudest moments came in 2033 when the Montana legislature passed a new law requiring comprehensive environmental disclosure for all property sales, including historical land use and any known contamination. I'd testified in favor of the bill, telling my story to a room full of legislators. The bill passed unanimously and was named the Property Truth in Sale Act. The judge who'd presided over my civil case sent me a personal note when she heard about the Montana law. Your willingness to fight for justice has rippled outward in ways you may never fully realize, she wrote. Thank you for your courage and perseverance. By 2035, the EPA officially closed the active remediation at my former Colorado property. Passive monitoring would continue, but the emergency phase was over. The land was slowly healing. Dr. Hayes, who'd stayed involved with the project throughout, sent me a final report along with a personal note. In my 30 years with the EPA, I've worked on hundreds of contaminated sites, she wrote. Most fade into bureaucratic obscurity. But your case will be remembered because you refused to let it be swept under the rug. You insisted on accountability, and that made all the difference. I kept that note in my desk drawer, along with the settlement check stub, the water contamination report, and the photo I'd taken of my Colorado ranch on the day I'd bought it, before everything went wrong. These artifacts reminded me of what I'd lost and what I'd learned. The cattle operation in Montana thrived. Beth's veterinary practice grew. We had a daughter in 2034 named Patricia, and we taught her from the earliest age about the importance of the land, the water, and the truth. When Patricia was old enough to ask questions, I told her the story of the Colorado ranch. I explained how sometimes bad people make bad decisions and how those decisions can hurt innocent people years or even decades later. I told her about the importance of fighting for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you everything. "Did you win, Daddy?" she asked. I thought about it. I'd lost my ranch, spent years in legal battles, endured stress and uncertainty. But the guilty had been punished, the contamination had been addressed, and laws had been changed to protect others. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "In the ways that matter most, yes, I won." Looking back now, from the perspective of my Montana porch, with clean water flowing from my well and healthy cattle grazing on untainted land, I can say with certainty that the whole ordeal, as terrible as it was, taught me the most important lesson of my life. The truth always surfaces eventually. You can bury toxic waste, you can hide contamination reports, you can route sewer lines over dump sites and hope nobody ever digs deep enough to find what you've concealed. But the earth keeps its own records, and sooner or later, what's buried comes to light. The HOA that had invaded my property, torn up my land, and inadvertently exposed decades of corporate crime had been acting in ignorance. They genuinely didn't know about the contamination, but their failure to maintain their own infrastructure, their aggressive pursuit of easement rights, and their initial unwillingness to fairly compensate me for damages had turned what could have been a cooperative effort into a legal battle. In the end, we'd both been victims of the same corporate malfeasance. The difference was that I'd been willing to fight not just for compensation, but for accountability. And that fight had mattered. The sewer line that ran under my ranch had been both a curse and an unlikely gift. A curse because its failure had destroyed my property and exposed me to toxic contamination. A gift because without that failure, the buried waste might never have been discovered, and dozens of families might have continued drinking contaminated water, living on poisoned land, never knowing why their children got sick or their wells ran foul. As I sit here in Montana, watching the sunset over mountains that have stood for millions of years, I think about the land in Colorado, slowly healing beneath EPA supervision. I think about the families who've moved on to new homes, new lives. I think about the executives serving prison sentences for crimes they thought they'd gotten away with. And I think about the laws that have been changed because people refuse to accept that justice has an expiration date. My story is one small thread in the larger tapestry of environmental justice, of standing up to corporate power, of refusing to be a silent victim. But it's my thread, and I'm proud of it. The sewer line that ran under my ranch led to the uncovering of truths that needed to be told, crimes that needed to be punished, and changes that needed to be made. And sometimes, that's what it takes. One person standing on their property, refusing to back down, insisting that the truth matters and that accountability is not negotiable. It cost me my Colorado ranch, but it gave me something more valuable. The knowledge that I'd done the right thing, that I'd fought the good fight, and that the land I stand on now is clean because somewhere else, other people are standing on poisoned ground and demanding the same justice I demanded. That's my legacy, and I'll carry it forward for the rest of my days.